You can see here a small, shiny structure has emerged at the entrance to Scarborough Shoal, together with what looks like a floating barrier across that entrance in images dated May 27th and 28th. One of the most sensitive hotspots in the South China West Philippine Sea, Scarborough Shoal lies fully within Manila's exclusive economic zone, but is controlled by China since a standoff with the Philippines in 2012. This latest development, which China's South China Sea probing initiative dismisses as, quote, random nonsense and imagination and speculation, comes 9 months after China announced a so-called nature reserve at the shoal, effectively restricting any access close to the lagoon. However, in 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague had ruled that fishermen from the Philippines and China had traditional fishing rights at Scarborough Shoal, and that Beijing had interfered with these rights in restricting access. Meanwhile, China has lashed out at the Philippines and Japan for entering talks to agree the boundary of their exclusive zones. And Philippine Defense Minister Gilberto Teodoro defines a new role for his nation within the First Island chain, shortly after Vietnam's president visited the country to deepen maritime security and defense cooperation. As China rails against closer cooperation between Manila, Tokyo and Hanoi, who is the common security threat that binds them together? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ming Kavat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Sana Hashmi, Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation Fellow, and Gemant Lalari, Jewish Policy Center Senior Non-Resident Fellow. A very warm welcome back, Sana and Jiman.
Thank you.
Gemant, so in your view, what could this structure actually be? We don't know whether it's temporary or fixed at the moment.
Let's call it what it is. Beijing's latest uninvited piece of lawn furniture in someone else's backyard. That's what it is. It's in a Philippine exclusive economic zone. It shouldn't be there. This shiny 10-meter metallic object at the lagoon's southern entrance isn't an environmental research tool or an optical illusion. It's a calculated piece of military tracking telemetry. In other words, it's a militarization of something that's supposed to be a nature reserve.
But how do we know this? If you can
Because in the past, they've done this over and over again. They put a little structure, and then it gets bigger, and it gets bigger. We call it salami slicing in the reverse direction. It's building a salami, not cutting a salami. And so it's classic cooking the frog or eating the elephants, slowly, bit by bit. It's definitely to me, the beginning of an aggressive activity.
Okay, and how is this linked, or is it ironic, Sana, that 9 months ago in September, they announced this nature reserve and it was meant to be protected? Does that not mean that there should be no construction?
I think it's not isolated. It's also a part of China's broader strategy of militarizing the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. As in also what you asked about China, China says something else but does something else. And what it does is it's being very aggressive, it's being coercive, and this is not something that's unprecedented. And I think we should just call it consolidating China's maritime claims in the West Philippine Sea. This is something that we have been seeing for the past decade. And I think this is just not new. This is a part of a broader strategy.
So do you think this could be the start of, a new mischief reef or, in the paracels, antelope reef?
Absolutely. As in, we can't really deny what China has been doing and China is doing. I think we should absolutely carefully listen to what the Philippines is saying, because they are actually experiencing China's coercive actions, aggression, and what is happening in the West Philippine Sea is just detrimental to the entire region. And I think we can't really rely on China when it says that it wants to protect the nature, it wants to protect the reefs, as in this is hardly anything that is connected to nature. This is all militarization of the region.
Okay. And Gemant, Ray Powell of Sea Light, who collected and released these satellite images, he said that it would be a breach of the Declaration of Conduct in the South China Sea. So if it does prove to be, because we still don't know, but if it proves to be a permanent structure, what should happen next?
Well, let's just make it clear. China is the main problem. It's changing the status quo, not just in the South Sea, but all around its borders. It's not just in the sea, but in the land as well. So regarding Ray Powell, he's spot on. It's a shameless breach of the Declaration of the Conduct of the Parties. But let's be clear. Beijing treats international agreements like a suggestion on a menu, okay? It's something that they choose to use or not use at their convenience. And because the international community has spent years issuing nothing but polite, strongly worded press releases that Beijing literally laughs at, China's leadership operates under the assumption that they face zero physical or financial penalties for violating the status quo. This complete absence of costs has hollowed out the region's current security architecture. Since PRC is controlled by a Leninist communist regime, I will remind the audience of this famous Lenin quote, "You probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw." So they're pushing, and no one is pushing back. Except now, the Philippine government is highlighting this problem.
Sana, the Philippine Defense Secretary at the Shangri-La Dialogue said that the Philippines would maintain a constant presence. And that is the pushback that Gemont mentioned. We know that for the first time, the US Coast Guard sent a cutter to join a maritime cooperative activity from the 26th to the 30th. How much of a deterrence do you think are these activities, these patrols, and especially if the US is involved?
In my view, it's something that we need right now. So I think that is an immediate response to what China has been doing. If you ask me if it has long-term deterrence value, I do not think so.
So why not long-term?
I think what we need is, first of all, collective efforts. And a lot of countries, like-minded countries, are trying to do that, trying to contain China. But then how do we really reach an agreement, an arrangement where there is a long-term solution to it? We talk about it, we issue statements, but do we really have an arrangement where China is actually deterred? And China cares about it. China doesn't really care about words. And the US presence does send some level of signaling, but is it enough? I don't think so. So I do believe that there needs to be a bigger solution to it.
So as in, are we saying that it can never be a constant presence, whereas China's presence can be constant? I mean, would China be installing these structures right before the eyes of American, Philippine, Australian Coast Guard officials or even Navy officials?
This has been happening, and I think what has also happened that the international community and like-minded countries have turned a blind eye to it. 2016 arbitrary ruling happened. There were a lot of statements, but then what a lot of countries did was actually nothing. Supporting Philippines is, of course, one step towards containing, deterring China. Then how do we counter China's infrastructure? Is it going to be countered through joint exercises? Good in the short term, but that's not a long-term solution at all.
Okay, let's get to the promise to Barack Obama. In 2015, Xi Jinping promised Barack Obama, then US President, China would not militarize the South China Sea. He said relevant construction activities that China are undertaking in the island of South Nansha Islands do not target or impact any country, and China does not intend to pursue militarization. So let's run through a quick timeline for Scarborough Shoal. In 2012, China gained effective control and maintaining continuous presence since then. In 2015, that was the promise to Barack Obama. In 2016, International Tribunal at The Hague rules traditional fishing rights for both Filipino and Chinese fishermen at Scarborough Shoal. In 2025, so September last year, China declares that nature reserve. Not long after that, China restricts access to the lagoon using a floating barrier, and then underwater structures appear, and this brings us up to the present day. Gemont, China has not kept its word. Sana mentioned it's got a credibility, effectively, that it's got a credibility problem. Why is Scarborough Shoal, why is it important to China?
It's part of a strategic triangle that if they control it, they will be able to control the entire South Sea or the Southeast Asian Sea or the West Philippine Sea, whatever you want to call it. And not only the sea, but also the air. They can create an air defense identification zone, just like they did off of China a few years ago, that was overlapping Japanese ADIZ and the Taiwanese ADIZ.
So why is that? Tell us about that.
Because what it means is
geography.
that they can claim control of aircraft or ships passing through those areas, and if they control it, they can limit it, which means that not only commercial shipping, but commercial airlines will have to be challenged by this control system. And in case of war, they're set up to shoot down or sink ships that are not part of their process. I think this is partly inspired by what the Iranians did in the Strait of Hormuz, or the Houthis in the Bab el-Mandab in the Red Sea. I think they were encouraged by the fact that sea control in those cases is very important, and they can do it.
Right. So this is a choke point between the South China Sea and
and there are other
Taiwan Strait.
and there are other main bases that they've already built on fake islands that they created, which was illegal, again, according to this 2016 UN tribunal.
Okay. China has also slammed Philippine Secretary Guibo Teodoro, who first mentioned the Philippines had raw information about that structure on Scarborough Shoal on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue. In his official speech in Singapore, he said this.
Today, I would like to introduce a vision of the Philippines. It is entitled The Archipelagic Sentinel, Guardian of the Freedom of the Seas, or a guardian of the freedom of the seas.
Teodoro has also positioned the Philippines as a point of convergence in a fragmented world. He's also said China continues its acts unabated and they are unrepentant with their expansionism. He told Bloomberg the Philippines seeks closer ties with Taiwan and other nations in the region who seek to deter China. Sana, what's your assessment of Teodoro? You know, he's very strong, he's very outspoken. It was interesting to contrast his speech with Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of War's at the Shangri-La Dialogue.
I think his speech and his demeanor at Shangri-La Dialogue is very much aligned with how the Marcos Jr. administration has been specifically on the South China Sea. They have been using all the elite conferences where they're invited to internationalize the South China issue. Because you look at it, ASEAN is so divided. So where do they go? They're, of course, developing their own capabilities, but then the other part of the strategy is also to internationalize the issue and then be vocal about it. Philippines has been one of the strongest countries in protecting, safeguarding their interests, their sovereignty, and I think this is where a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific region need to learn what the Philippines is doing. And I totally agree with him when he said that Philippines could be a point of convergence and a binding factor in this fragmented world, specifically in the Indo-Pacific, where the US is kind of overstretched, looking at China as a friendly country. But then the foundational threats remain very much there. So China is changing the facts on ground and also at sea. So victims are India, Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan. And we are lacking the leadership from the US. So I think all the middle powers, as Australian Prime Minister also said a little while ago, and Canadian Prime Minister, that middle powers are playing a bigger role. And I think this is what the Philippines is doing. There is a lot of contrast between how the Philippines is acting and now how the US is acting. And I think I'm siding with the Philippines now.
Gemont, archipelagic century, you know, guardian of freedom on the seas in the Indo-Pacific. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it goes back to President Marcos's concept as well. The idea that, well, first of all, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines are all island countries. And so, therefore,
But it is the century, so the guardian.
Right.
What position does Teodoro, and actually it came from Jay Batang Bakal originally.
Right. What's
this position that they're carving out?
I think they're leading the way in terms of defining what they're doing in terms of their sovereignty, and I'm actually convinced that the United States is supporting their position and letting them lead, because by leading from their position physically in Asia. It's not the United States that's sticking itself in front. It's these countries that are being abused by China. So I think that's and these countries can relate to that framework because they're all in the same situation. So I think that he wouldn't have said that if he didn't have the support of his mutual defense treaty ally.
Okay, so on that theme, former China ambassador to the US, Cui Tiankai, complained at Shangri-La Dialogue that international media get it wrong about Taiwan. Listen.
We will do whatever to protect our sovereignty, territorial integrity, and have national unity. So no other country should interfere. And it's a totally wrong interpretation to see this as some kind of a regional conflict. No, it's not.
Sana, is it a regional issue?
It is very much a regional issue. Taiwan is a country, and Taiwan is a self-governing country with its own people. So, of course, when China says that Taiwan is an internal affair, this is a strategic narrative that they want to establish. But is it a reality? I do not think so. And, of course, the world knows that it's not a reality. Taiwan, whatever happens in the Taiwan Strait is going to impact everyone. So it's absolutely a regional issue.
Come on. I mean, China has threatened the sovereignty of Taiwan, of the Philippines, of Japan. Has it not pushed, I think you said it, you pushed them together? Yeah,
it's their fault that this is happening. And it's ironic that they don't understand that. I think it's good that they don't understand it, because the more they push, the more these countries get together. And also, the United States becomes part of the solution as well.
On that, Gemon, interestingly, isn't it? Because Pete Hegseth's speech, obviously very different from last year, obviously affected by the Trump-Xi summit. So do you think, is there an agreement between the US and its allies? Does the US say, we're going to soften up on China, or we're going to do everything we can not to provoke China, including not talking about Taiwan, but you have free rein to do that? Do you think there's an arrangement there?
I think so. I think, and also I don't think the United States needs to pound the table about Taiwan, because the countries themselves are doing a pretty good job. And the actions of these countries, for example, Japan doubling its defense budget to 2%, the Philippines aggressively trying to get more arms from many countries, Australia, United States is also helping the Philippines with a $2.5 billion foreign military sales. So you don't need to say something, but if you look at their actions, it's clear to me the United States is heavily engaged in this region.
So you spoke about arms sales. When does, softening rhetoric become something quite different, when arms, badly needed arms to Taiwan, are not delivered?
I agree. And I think the main reason it was delayed, according to what most press reports said, was because the United States does not know what's going to happen in Iran, and some of those resources.
Hegseth said that needed to be decoupled.
He did, but I think the reality is, especially missile defense systems, is definitely something that the U.S. is weak on, and they're not willing to commit right now to a non-war environment over a war environment like Iran.
Okay, Vietnam's President Do Lam visited the Philippines after addressing the Shangri-La Dialogue, and the two sides established an enhanced strategic partnership focusing heavily on maritime security, defense cooperation, and joint opposition to Chinese aggressions. They also signed a 5-year defense cooperation agreement. Sana, so we now have Vietnam joining forces with the Philippines, and we had Japan already. What does it say about this? I mean, on one side, Vietnam was, the president was asked a question by a Chinese delegate. Is it not true that a friendly, cooperative agreement with China means that there can be peace and stability? On the other hand, the president's going straight to the Philippines and deepening cooperation, military cooperation with the Philippines.
I think it's a very interesting question, because I would say that China has been a unifying factor for Philippines and Vietnam to work together. And maritime domain capabilities is also something that is bringing them together. But of course, even though China is there, both Philippines and Vietnam have totally different strategies to deal with China. As Philippines is more into internationalizing, being more vocal against the Chinese. So I would say that there is more hedging within the Vietnamese leadership rather than the Philippines. But also, Vietnam is one country that goes and engages with a lot of countries in the region. Vietnam and India also were engaged in resource extraction in the South China Sea. So I feel China is a threat, but Vietnam has found its own strategy to deal with China. But I would say that hasn't really worked in the past. Accommodation with China is something that hasn't worked, and I don't think it's going to work, specifically in the South China Sea. So in my opinion, I would say there needs to be a collective response. And even before we look at countries such as Japan and India and the US, ASEAN needs to come together.
Okay, so, the hedging of Vietnam, does that reduce it as a partner for the Philippines, reduce its value, or does it increase its value?
The fact that the president of Vietnam went to the Philippines to have a discussion and conclude an agreement should make China scared. Why? Because if the West Philippine Sea and the East Vietnamese Sea are both closed together, that means the entire 9-dash line becomes useless. And that's the problem that China has with this agreement. It's tearing apart their perfect little world that they try to create with this 9-dash line.
China has lashed out also over Manila and Tokyo's announcement to start talks to establish maritime boundaries for their currently overlapping exclusive zones and continental shelves. Now, Taiwan is sandwiched between the two countries, meaning there are also overlapping exclusive zones measuring 200 nautical miles from a country's coast for Taiwan. In response, China sent on June 1st and 2nd its Coast Guard on so-called law enforcement patrols, which it said was a, quote, necessary measure to protect its sovereignty. Those patrols encircled Taiwan. Now, we understand from the Taiwan government that its diplomatic officers are already in touch with relevant officials in the Philippines and Japan to join the discussions when they begin. Now, Taiwan's Ocean Affairs Council told Taiwan Talks this. Taiwan has sovereignty and sovereign rights over waters off the eastern coasts of Taiwan and has helped maintain the peaceful international order for many years as a result. On China's reaction, it says China does not have rights there and cannot acquire rights by sending patrol vessels there, which Taiwan says are its grey zone tactics intending to threaten Taiwan and the international public order. Moreover, under the guise of protesting to Japan and the Philippines, China created a facade that it has jurisdiction over Taiwan and Taiwan's water. The OAC calls for the international community to identify China's real intention as to subvert peace and international order. So, Sana, what do you make of this situation?
China is against everything that countries do together because it sees cooperation among like-minded countries and among sovereign countries as coalition against China, be it the South China Sea, be it the Taiwan Strait. And when Japan and Philippines converge together, specifically in the maritime domain, that means that would also strengthen Manila's claims in the South China Sea, and there is more effort for communication and coordination. And then if you look at Japan and Philippines individually, these are the two countries that have been very vocal against China. And I think I would say that Philippines and Japan are the two countries that are actually holding the fort against China as well. So that's a nightmarish situation for China when Japan and Philippines are coming together.
And Jiman, it's true, they've been the most vocal, and especially in support of Taiwan itself. Do you sense that China's also using this to drive a wedge, perhaps, between Taiwan and Japan, Philippines?
It's a defensive mechanism. They're being faced by an aggressive country that's expanding, and so their reaction to is, let's figure out where we need a border. And I would say this is very important, and it shows that these are countries independently of the United States or China. They're just demarcating their boundaries. This is what China has done in the past, and many countries do this in the past. So it's a normal activity. And what I think one of the key things about this is that I think it challenges the 11-dash line, which goes past Taiwan. And that's the area where Japan and the Philippines have this discussion. So if they delineate this area, then the 11-dash line is completely thrown out in the trash.
Taiwan's foreign ministry has argued that perhaps, China might use this as a context to change the status quo, the fact that Japan and the Philippines are negotiating. What do you think about that?
China has been changing the status quo for the longest time now. The South China Sea, Taiwan Strait since 2022, South China Sea since 2013 and 14. So I think this is a concern that has been long-standing, protracted. But then I think intensification of changing the status quo unilaterally is something that we really need to pay attention. As in, the international community couldn't do much in the past 10 years, but perhaps this is the time when international community really needs to focus on. And they need to listen to what Taiwan is saying. They need to listen to what the Philippines is saying.
Right. Jiman, Tokyo said that any agreement wouldn't be binding on third parties, and therefore, there wouldn't be an issue with international law. For Taiwan's position, does Taiwan need to worry about that statement?
Not at all. In fact, it's actually encouraging, because what it does say is that it's saying that the demarcation shows that China does not have a claim on the east side of Taiwan. And in fact, by acknowledging that they have a claim, and if you look at the actual areas, these are areas that were also where missiles landed in 2022. So I don't understand why China's complaining about something like this, because they're actually causing this cooperation, and Taiwan was the victim of that. So, in effect, these two countries are saying, hey, Taiwan, we're on your side. We're doing this to help you.
Mm-hmm.